Hello guys, Phil here. So I was starting to prep to do a video on a little bit about Stephen Lett, and as I was looking into him, I realized that to understand the early part of his JW career, you really need to understand the draft in the United States and how it affected Jehovah's Witnesses in the 60s. So I think I'll break it up a little bit. So this video I'll talk specifically about the draft and conscription in around the Vietnam War to give us a little background for future use. So just to go back a little bit, in World War II, there was a draft in the US and all young guys were eligible for the draft. That ended in 1947. And then almost immediately in 1948, a new Selective Service Act was passed into law. And so that continued the idea of mandatory conscription. So I guess I never really realized that from World War II on until 1973 or so, military service was mandatory for all young men in the United States. And so in that period of about 25 years, there were times of war and there were times of peace. So there was the Korean War and the Vietnam War, and then there were sort of lulls in between those wars. But all through that period, all guys between the ages of 18 and 26 were obligated to do time in the military, to do about 2 years typically. So during the peace times, quote unquote, there was not a need for very many soldiers, and then the need would ramp up during those, during Korea and Vietnam there. And so how the draft boards would do it was they would kind of use deferments to manage how many guys actually got inducted into the military each year. So if it was a peacetime, they were very generous with the deferments. And if it was wartime, they got real stingy with the deferments. But even in the peace times, in the lulls, there was a fair number of guys that were still being drafted into the military. So for example, Samuel Hurd, another governing body member, he was one that was drafted in the peacetime. And so he was in the Army. He served from 1954 to 1956, mainly in Germany. Elvis Presley was another fella who was drafted during peacetime, and he served from 1958 to 1960, also mainly in Germany. And then as the Vietnam War started to ramp up more and more each year in the second half of the 60s, more and more men were being inducted into the military to meet the demand. Now, I think it's safe to say that there are very few young guys in the US that actually had any desire to serve in the Vietnam War and to go overseas and fight. And so certainly this included young witness guys who, they didn't want to go to Vietnam any more than the next guy, but they were also forbidden by the religion to serve in the military. So there was kind of this two-layer thing going on for young witnesses. And so what we'll do, we'll take a look at some of the common ways that guys would try and defer being drafted, and then we'll see how each of those would work for your typical witness guy. So one option that guys could do was to enlist into the National Guard or into the reserves instead of the military. So that was kind of a decent option because you were doing military service, but it was extremely unlikely that you would ever have to leave American soil, that you would be sent overseas. So throughout the Vietnam War, there was a total of maybe only 10 or 15,000 National Guard troops that were ever actually sent over to Vietnam. So that was kind of a nice option. My dad, for example, he was one that took advantage of that. So he's the same age as Steve Lett. He was able to kind of pull some whatever connections he had to get into the National Guard. So obviously it was something everybody would want to do if that was the choices, was the military or the National Guard. But the National Guard only took so many guys each year. So my dad always liked to tell the story. Actually, his National Guard notice and his draft notice arrived in the mail the same day, and so he always made sure he opened the National Guard one first so that he could tell the army, "Sorry guys, I already got, I'm already in the Guard." So that was one option. Obviously, not an option for witnesses. Now, for a few years, another option was getting married. So in September of 1963, JFK Kennedy advised the draft boards that married men with children should be moved to the bottom of the list of guys getting inducted. And then right above them, they should put all the married men. So that was kind of a good option. It only lasted a couple of years. In August of 65, President Johnson ended that, sort of official, unofficial directive from the presidency. And so that marriage exemption was ended. But if you were up in those couple years there, that 63 to 65 era, getting married was actually a pretty good way to not be drafted. And I think for young witness guys in those few years, that probably would have been a pretty good option because, witnesses tend to get married pretty young. So, all right, now a third option to try and defer being drafted was going to college and being a student. So this was one of those deferments that in peacetime it was really generous, and then in wartime it was really hard to get a student deferment. So in the peace times, you could kind of milk it. So you could do 4 years in college and then go to grad school. And, if you took long enough, hopefully, and stretched out your grad school, you might be able to be in college even the entire 8 years that you were eligible for the draft until 26. Then you would have aged out of being eligible. So that worked pretty good in like I say, in peacetime, and then during the Vietnam War, during the hot years, they got more and more stingy about student deferment, so it was harder to use those for very long to not be drafted. And again, this is one that for witnesses probably wasn't much of an option anyways because college was frowned on so heavily. Okay, a fourth option was to declare yourself as a conscientious objector. This is an option that in World War I, it wasn't much of a thing back then. So there were a fair amount of guys, including Bible students, who just ended up doing time in military prisons when they tried to be a conscientious objector. But by World War II, the conscientious objector status program, whatever you want to say, was very well organized. It was pretty straightforward in the US government. I guess that's something I hadn't really realized, being raised as a witness. In my head, it was always if you weren't in the military, you would go to prison. But the conscientious objector was set up pretty well from World War II on. The thing was, it wasn't just witnesses. There was other small religious groups that held the same idea that they objected to carrying a gun in combat. And so groups like the Mennonites, for example, wanted to be conscientious objectors. And certainly there were individuals that felt that way too. So during World War II, what they did was they had camps set up that would kind of take all the conscientious objectors. And these were called Civilian Public Service Camps, or CPS camps. And basically, if you're familiar with the Civilian Conservation Corps that was running during the Great Depression in the 30s, these CPS camps were very similar. So they were kind of like all the young guys would be in these camps, and then they would work on something for the public good. So public works projects, national parks, fighting forest fires, working in hospitals, something along that line. So during the World War II at its peak, there were 152 of these camps around the United States. Now, after World War II, those camps kind of disbanded, and the military didn't really do that anymore. And so during the Vietnam War and down through today, there's what it's called today the Alternative Service Program. And pretty much it's like working at a job, basically. So you go to a job every day, like a hospital or a nursing home or some kind of community service need like that. And you get paid and everything, and you do your 2 years that way. Now, the military basically puts conscientious objectors into two categories. Classification 1A, that's like a straight up, like a soldier who's, eligible for combat. So 1AO is the non-combatant military. So this is somebody that is willing to serve in the military. They're willing to put on a uniform, but they won't carry a gun. There was that movie a couple of years back, Hacksaw Ridge, and it was based on the true story of Desmond Doss. He was a Seventh-day Adventist and that was his stance, that he would wear the uniform, but he wouldn't carry a gun. So that was a 1AO conscientious objector. And then the second category was 1O. So these were folks that opposed all military service. They wouldn't put on a uniform, wouldn't be in the military, and so they were the ones that would do this community work instead. So it's basically a very well set up program. The trouble is that for Jehovah's Witnesses, historically, this has not been an option. The society has said that doing this alternative community service is the same thing, in other words, as being in the military. And so this rather odd stance has caused a lot of problems for young witness guys around the world over the decades. Various governments have tried to work with the witnesses over the years with varying degrees of success and cooperation, trying to find something that these witness guys would be willing to do to fulfill their community service obligation in their country. One of the most interesting ones I ran across was in the 91 yearbook, and so that was talking about Sweden in the 1970s, Sweden being another country with mandatory military service or alternative service for all young men. So the witnesses had their stance that they wouldn't do either one. And it talks about one, it seems like very flexible government official. And eventually he said, he was meeting with the witness officials, and he said, listen, guys, how about the young guys can pioneer for 2 years, and we'll just count all their pioneer hours as going towards their community service. It's arguable whether that's community service in the true sense of the word, but we'll just count all the pioneer hours and call it a day. How about that? And the witnesses said, oh, no can do. Nope, nope, nope. And essentially it boiled down to, if you tell us to pioneer, well, we're going to refuse to pioneer, which is that's a head scratcher, that one. Now, in 1996, the Watchtower Society published an article that to some degree reversed this stance, and they did kind of okay doing alternative service. Now, I will say, when you read the article, it has some fairly specific conditions to it. So, for example, it says, would performing it prevent or unreasonably limit them from fulfilling their Christian responsibilities? And you see the scriptures there about preaching and attending the meetings. On the other hand, would they be able to continue to make spiritual progress, perhaps even sharing in the full-time ministry while performing the required service? So you can see basically they're saying, yeah, you could probably do this, but you better be able to attend all the meetings and be a regular pioneer while simultaneously fulfilling your alternative service. And I feel like that could be kind of a tricky thing, because I assume that the community service is, a 40-hour-a-week kind of thing. And then to try and get your pioneer hours on top of that, that's, that could be tricky. But at any rate, even that was not an option at all during the Vietnam War era. And so we get to the final method of deferring, and really the only one open to Jehovah's Witnesses at the time, and that was being a minister. So that was classification 4D under the selective service. Now, during World War II, Jehovah's Witnesses tried this argument of saying that every witness in the congregation is a minister, and so everyone in the congregation should get the 4D classification if they need it. The government, that strategy was a bust. They basically said, come on, guys, get real. And then the draft ended in 1947, but then it almost immediately, there was a new draft starting in 1948, And so the society saw that it was going to continue to be an issue for them. And so Hayden Covington, who was the society's general counsel at that point, began to work on putting together some legal advice for young witness guys. And so in 1950, he wrote, and the society published a publication with the catchy name of Memorandum in reference to the classification of Jehovah's Witnesses. So this was used in two ways. It was sent to the Selective Service Department, and it was also, there was a copy given to each congregation for young guys to reference. Then in 1953, Hayden wrote a 32-page booklet titled Procedure of Jehovah's Witnesses under Selective Service. And so this was a little more of like a handbook for witness guys to use. It wasn't really something you would give to the draft board, but it kind of helped them. And then in 1954, he also published a 4-page addendum to that booklet with even more specific tips about going before the draft board. And so basically these publications, they kind of explain the draft process, how to file. Actually, they recommended filing both as a conscientious objector and a minister simultaneously, and it walked young guys through that, as well as then how to appeal draft board decisions if they didn't get the 4D classification. So it's a fairly involved process that the young guys had to go through. For example, this is the 1953 booklet, and on page 4, it says, advanced study and preparation necessary. The minister desiring to claim exemption needs much advanced preparation and study, along with his ministry in the field. This should be started when he is approaching the age of registration and should be continued until the time arrives when it is required. He should be thoroughly familiar with the material contained in chapters 19 and 20 of Let God Be True, pages 21 through 29 of Defending and Legally Establishing the Good News, pages 3 through 5 of Council on Theocratic Organization, pages 3 through 15 of Memorandum in reference to the classification of Jehovah's Witnesses, and other available material. So those were some of the provisions available to help young witness guys. Definitely by the Vietnam era for sure. I'm not quite sure when they started, but by Vietnam, the society had a couple of documents prepared, that a couple of forms that could really help you to plead your case before the draft board. However, for you to get them, you had to do a little something for the society in return. A little quid pro quo action, if you will. So for example, we see the February 68 Kingdom Ministry on page 3 says, publishers of draft age or approaching that age, please note that the congregation's servant possesses a memorandum on procedure of Jehovah's Witnesses under Selective Service for study and assistance in making proof of ministerial status before Selective Service boards. Regular pioneers on the list for at least 3 months and who have met the goals and who will continue pioneering may request a certificate for pioneer minister for filing with the Selective Service Board. This does not apply to vacation pioneers. So here we see it mentions the certificate for pioneer minister that the society would grant regular pioneers who were meeting all their goals. And when it says that, what does it mean by goals? Well, there were a number of quotas at that time that pioneers needed to meet. Now, certainly they had an hour quota. It was 100 hours a month at that point. But I didn't quite realize that they also had other quotas that they needed to meet. So a regular pioneer needed to be placing 100 magazines each month. They needed to be making at least 35 back calls or return visits. They needed to be conducting 7 Bible studies every week. So those were the goals that they needed to be meeting in order for the society to give them that certificate. In the January 76 Kingdom Ministry, it says, since at times a request is made by officials for some evidence of ordination on the part of those serving in such capacities, a certificate for ordained minister has been prepared and will be supplied on request to those elders or ministerial servants needing it. It will show the date not of their baptism, but when they were appointed to serve in such capacities, and hence when a laying on of hands took place in their case. So that was a second document that was available to guys that were up for the draft. Essentially, there were 4 roles for which the society would agree to give you one of these documents so that you didn't have to do time in prison as a draft dodger. So what were the 4 roles? Well, you could get one if you were the congregation servant. So remember, this is before the elder arrangement came back. It was in the in-between time. So yeah, congregation servants could get that. Now, obviously, there weren't too many 18-year-old congregation servants floating around, so not super helpful for young witness guys. Ministerial servants could get one. Now, that sounds more promising, right? However, conveniently, the society had a hard and fast rule at that time that you could not be appointed a ministerial servant until you turned 20. So in the August 75 KM, we see ministerial servants must be at least 20 years old at the time of making the recommendation, and they must be baptized for at least a year. So if you could be drafted at 18, being appointed a servant at 20, again, not super helpful. So that leaves us with 2 options. You could pioneer, or you could go to Bethel. If you did one of those things for the society, they would in turn give you that certificate you needed. So the mandatory draft, on the one hand, combined with the Watchtower doctrine of that you had to refuse to be a conscientious objector, this created this really cool scenario, at least from the society's point of view. They were now in this position where they could essentially require these young guys to do literally anything the society wanted them to, and they would have to play along because the only other option was doing hard time in prison. And obviously, as we know, with this power differential, the society was going to require these guys to do things that benefited the society. And so when you really boil it down, the 2 options were to be an unpaid book salesman, a pioneer, or work for free printing the books at the Watchtower factory at Bethel. I don't think it really mattered to the society which one of those options you picked, because both of them serve the fundamental Watchtower business model of printing religious literature at cost and then selling it at a profit. Now, obviously, being a religion, the Watchtower Society is a nonprofit organization, but that's not to say they were selling the magazines and books at their cost. Instead, the society was basically built on, it ran on the profits from all the literature that they were selling. And there's a key point that I don't think I really ever understood well as a witness, and that is that the customers were not the public being preached to door to door. The customers of the society were the congregation publishers and pioneers who were buying the literature each month at the literature counter. You know, if they didn't place all their magazines one month, that was too bad, but it wasn't like they could return them to the magazine counter for a refund. All sales were final. The society's money was made at that point. So we can definitely see that for a young witness guy in the late 60s, starting to regular pioneer after you graduated high school, that was a no-brainer. You just automatically had to start pioneering. Now, pioneering had the advantage compared to Bethel in that you definitely had more personal freedom, but it had the disadvantage of having to support yourself. You know, it's challenging now for pioneers to support themselves while getting 70 hours a month preaching. And so back then, getting 100 hours a month while supporting yourself was, I'm sure, even tougher. And especially when you consider that most pioneers then were, I think, doing pretty much the same typically low-wage jobs that pioneers are doing today. So I'm guessing that Bethel probably for a lot of young guys appeared more attractive in that sense. And I think too, like today, that serving at Bethel had a certain cachet for witnesses who'd never done it before and didn't really know the realities of what it was like exactly to work at Bethel. And so the standard track kind of emerged during the Vietnam War that you would start regular pioneering, and then a lot of guys would go to Bethel after a little while. To go to Bethel nowadays, there's several requirements, right? You basically have to be a regular pioneer. You need to be at least 19 years old and agree to stay for at least 1 year there. It was a little different back in the day, because once the mandatory conscription laws kicked in 1948, the society had gradually started to ramp up the minimum length of stay at Bethel until by the Vietnam era, it was up to a rather staggering 4-year minimum to go to Bethel. So if you look at this is the April 71 Kingdom Ministry, page 4. It has some interesting points here. For example, it says applicants agree to serve at Bethel for at least 4 years and work hard. Now there were other requirements too. The society could essentially dream up any rules that they desired, and a draftable JW guy could not argue. And so another requirement the society imposed was that guys who went to Bethel had to be celibate for 4 years. If you got married, you had to leave Bethel. And again, leaving Bethel, not an option. Now you might think, well, couldn't you leave Bethel and start regular pioneering again? Well, we'll see in a minute why that didn't work. So yeah, you had to be celibate for 4 years. Couldn't get married until at least after that time was up. In fact, at the time, a couple needed a minimum of 14 years of full-time service between the two of them before a Bethelite could stay at Bethel with his wife. Interestingly, that held even if both the guy and the girl were already at Bethel. Even if they were both Bethelites, to remain at Bethel as a married couple, they still needed that 14 years between them. Now we see too, notice the minimum age to go to Bethel. They were taking brothers from 17 years old on. And that kind of makes sense, because if you could be drafted at 18, then a minimum age of 19 would have been too late. So with a minimum of 17, guys could again come right out of high school, start pioneering, and head off to Bethel. And we see there it mentions brothers invited to Bethel are usually chosen from applicants who are regular or special pioneers and who have received a minister's 4D draft classification or one exempting them from call. Yeah, it was all about getting that 4D classification. I think another thing to remember too is that the Vietnam era of the late 60s and early 70s, well, that was the exact same era that the whole 1975 buildup was on among Jehovah's Witnesses in the organization. And so in that period, there was more pioneers than ever before. And that meant that the society was selling more books and magazines than ever before to congregation members. In fact, they were selling more books than they could even print. And so we see a number of articles during this time period in the Kingdom Ministry about trying to get guys to go to Bethel so they could run the printing presses longer. So for example, this is the September 71 KM. It says, here at Brooklyn, we have on hand orders for some 19 million bound books, and congregation orders for the publications released at the recent district assemblies have not even yet begun to arrive. And it mentions they're going to start running the presses on a night shift there. And so it says, we would like to bring in 100 or more strong single brothers between 18 and 45 years of age as temporary workers for 1 year. So this was a little interesting one-time arrangement that the society did, that they took 100 guys for a 1-year minimum stay at Bethel. And that was pretty popular in the KMs in the next few months. It mentions that over 1,000 guys applied for that 1-year stay. But that was just a one-time thing. They went right back to the 4-year minimum otherwise. In the October 72 KM, we see a letter here. It says, here at Bethel, we seem to be busier than ever. The backlog of books on order is about 16 million. To help us meet the demand, we have been temporarily running 3 bindery lines at night. Really, an average month's work here is tremendous. We see the May 74 KM. It says, so right now there are orders from throughout the world for over 35 million books and Bibles. The supplies of most of the branches are very low, and all of this despite the fact that for months now, About 75 brothers have been running many of the bindery machines on an all-night shift. So yeah, they were selling books hand over fist in this time period. And as you read these articles, these letters to the publishers, you can sense almost a little tinge of frustration that they could be making more money, that because the books were a quarter a piece, the Bibles were a buck a piece. There was millions of dollars they were leaving on the table because they just could not get enough guys to keep the presses running 24/7. I'll put a plug in here for a really interesting book that was published last year called New Boy by Keith Casarona. I'll put a link below, but you can find it on Amazon or whatever. So Keith was a Bethelite from 1970 to 1974, so right in that prime period we're talking about. And it's a really interesting, like, raw look at the good, but mostly the bad of what it was like to be at Bethel back then. Now, I want to mention this is not a super polished book. It's not like reading Crisis of Conscience. There's little typos here and there. There's little errors and minor details here and there. But the story is really good. It's really real. And it's a little, I don't know what the word is, tongue-in-cheek or a little snarky sometimes, like kind of funny. As I was reading, I was like, boy, what does this book remind me of? And I finally realized there's this author, Daniel Pinkwater, who mainly actually writes kids' books. He had one book called Lizard Music that I read when I was little. But it has the same kind of like short, snappy sentences that are kind of funny. And that's what the book New Boy is like. So I definitely recommend it if you want more information on life at Bethel back in those days. But basically, he describes that it was fairly rough. I mean, as you can imagine, seeing how far behind they were on their production schedules and, running night shifts. So yeah, the hours were long at Bethel and the work was extremely monotonous. That's one thing you notice, like each of these articles about how behind Bethel was. All of them seem to have a subheading about trying to argue that, well, even if it is super monotonous, it's a worthy cause and whatnot. So guys were definitely getting burned out at Bethel. But the thing is that the society had designed it very cleverly so that you would be very unwise to leave before your 4 years were up. Now you could leave. It's not like the doors were barred. But then if you did leave before your 4 years were up, the society wouldn't let you be a regular pioneer for 6 months after you left. And I mean, normally you'd think, well, no big deal, right? But the thing is, if you weren't at Bethel and you weren't pioneering, now you're in danger of losing that 4D minister classification and leaving yourself wide open either to the draft or doing prison time as a draft dodger. I mean, it was kind of impressive, in a twisted way, how the society used the draft laws of the day to basically ensure there would be this generation of young men that would either have to be book salesmen or factory workers for Watchtower. The Bethelites at that time were making, I think, a whopping 12 cents an hour on the presses. Now, there was one twist that kind of interestingly arose in 1969, and that is in December, the first draft lottery was held. So the lotteries were meant to kind of correct some inequities that a lot of people felt that the draft boards had, where, if you had connections or you were wealthy, you could pull some strings and get a deferment, and then the poor guys with no connections were all the ones getting drafted. And so the draft lottery was meant to kind of equalize and be a more fair version of the draft. So the first one, the 1969 lottery, covered all men born between 1944 and 1950. And then the following ones each year after that kind of covered, 1970, did the 1951 birth dates and so on like that. And basically they would pull a lottery ball with a day of the year on it, and whatever order they were pulled, that was the order that men were going to be called up to be inducted into the military. So, for example, in 1969, they eventually used the first 195 dates. Now, the effect was that if you had a high draft number, it was very unlikely that you would be called up. And so even if you lost your deferment that you were using, you were probably still safe. So inside Bethel, it created this situation where all of a sudden some guys didn't have to worry anymore about being drafted, but they were still stuck in this rough Bethel living situation because they'd signed up to stay there for 4 years. And so there was a lot of unhappy campers in Bethel at that point. But as you know, as long as the society had the draft that was hanging over young guys' heads, there was really no incentive, no reason for them to change the status quo. But if the US government ever changed the draft laws, that is the one thing that could put leverage on the society. And sure enough, things did start to change. Obviously, the draft was super unpopular in the US. And after several years of research, the government decided that they could safely end mandatory military service and switch to an all-volunteer military. It was in 1975 that President Ford formally signed a proclamation to end the Selective Service Act requiring all men to register for military service. And unfortunately for the society, who had depended on those draft laws for decades now to create almost this generation of indentured servants that could staff Bethel, that proclamation 4360 signaled the end of the halcyon days. And so almost in lockstep with the draft laws changing, society's policies changed as well. So we get a key bit of information in the June 76 Kingdom Ministry. It said, the government has announced that the selective service arrangement ceased to function as of January 23rd, so none now reaching 18 years of age will have to register. Brothers of draft age who are in the pioneer service or elders or ministerial servants should not request of the society certificates to use verifying their ordination, since the draft arrangement no longer functions. So you notice the date in particular in this announcement, that January 23rd was the complete end of the draft of the selective service arrangement. As that happened, almost simultaneously, the society's policies changed in consequence. So for example, in the March 76 Kingdom Ministry, we see an announcement. It says, those desiring to enter Bethel service will be interested to know that there is a new application form. Persons now being called to Bethel are asked to stay for 1 year as a test of their fitness first, and at the end of that year they may request to remain and continue their service. And so how interesting is that announcement, right? That almost immediately as the draft law ended, the society had to end their 4-year minimum stay at Bethel. Actually, just a couple of days ago, there was a really interesting post on the XJW subreddit, and it was from a Bethelite who's actually there at Bethel in that early 1976 time frame. So I'll link to it below, but just to relate the highlights, he mentions that it was a Saturday morning, January 10th of 76, when it was announced at morning worship that the 4-year arrangement was ending. He mentions that the whole Bethel dining room just erupted with young Bethel guys cheering and clapping, and they were so happy that they could leave Bethel. He says it kind of caught the Bethel heavies, the old folks, caught them by surprise. He mentioned something else interesting, and that is that there must have been a lot of discussion and bickering going on behind the scenes among the Bethel head honchos about what to do when the draft ended. He mentions that just a few weeks earlier, Nathan Knorr, the president, had been chairing the morning worship session, and this is something that Keith Casarona mentions in his book New Boy as well, that Nathan Knorr seemed to like to use his time running morning worship as kind of personal venting sessions to complain about whatever Bethelites were giving him a headache. And so at this particular morning worship, he made a remark that, can you believe, some Bethelites don't want to stay their full 4 years? And he basically said, over my dead body, are we going to change that arrangement? Which is a little funny considering he died in 1977. So he said that, in December, evidently, and then here, and so the Bethel guys that heard that basically thought, well, that's that. And then here in January, the announcement was made that the 4-year arrangement was actually ending. So it was a welcome surprise. And basically how it worked was they said anybody who had a year in after May 76, they would be allowed to leave Bethel. And they called it Leaving on the Mayflower. And so evidently there was a bit of a mass exodus from Bethel. A lot of the guys took advantage of that. And hence why we see announcements like that one in the March 76 KM, where they're already, seeking new guys to replace all the Bethelites that were leaving in the coming months. I guess the one good thing for the society, from one standpoint, was that they probably didn't need to have a third shift running the printing presses after August of 1975. So 75 was the big year, something was supposed to happen. Evidently, everyone viewed the end of the service year as the cutoff for when Armageddon was supposed to come. So, when nothing happened by the end of August in 75, the foot came off the gas hard for pretty much all witnesses. And so we can see that in for example, in the December 75 Kingdom Ministry, that was the one, so they were a few months behind. So that the December one published the September figures for the U.S. branch territory. And so you notice it says, the September report shows a drop in the number of hours spent in the field, the books, magazines, and subscriptions placed, the return visits made, and the Bible studies conducted compared with the same month the previous year. So it was an immediate effect. Notice the next month, so the January 76 KM, that had the October figures. And so you notice this article right on the first page. It says, a recent survey showing that about 30% of the publishers in this country are irregular in their field service. Can you imagine? 30% of the entire country was irregular. Wow. So basically, since 1968, the society had just had continuous, unending month over month new peaks of publishers and pioneers and any statistic you can think of. And so as of September 75, things just dropped off a cliff. It was a very abrupt change. And you see where the society tried to get things moving again. So, for example, in the January 76 KM, they actually changed the title of the publication. So it used to be Kingdom Ministry. Now they changed it to Our Kingdom Service. And I know this is going to shock you, but that didn't fix everything. And so they continued, in October 76, that was when they dropped the hour requirements for pioneers. So regular pioneer hours went from 100 to 90. Auxiliary pioneers went from 75 to 60. But really, in the end, it wasn't all the way until 1979 that the average publisher and pioneer numbers got back to even match where they had been in 1975. And so as far as the draft, the U.S. has never had to return to mandatory military service for young men. And so the society, the Watchtower Society, has never been able to raise the minimum Bethel stay beyond 1 year again. At least if they wanted to get enough people through the doors to keep the presses running. Now, obviously, in the decades since then, printed literature has kind of become less and less important and been, actively de-emphasized by the society. And really, in recent years, the problem has gone the other way, where there's too many Bethelites. And so we saw, for example, in 2016, where 20% of all Bethelites were laid off, were let go. Yeah, the Bethel numbers dropped from 25,000 to 20,000 Bethelites that year. So that kind of brings us up to the present day. So like I say, that's a little look at the draft and in the U.S. and how it affected witnesses in general. And so in a future video, we'll take a look at specifically how that impacted what young witnesses, including governing body members, did with their life during the Vietnam War. But yeah, so anyways, well, thanks for watching, guys. Subscribe if you feel like it. But at any rate, I'll catch you in the next video. Take care.